What can Africa learn from the US, Israel, Iran conflict that is shaking the Middle East right now? I happen to think there's a lot we can learn. Much like a boxer analyzes the moves and techniques of the opponent they're about to face, I think it's important that Africa does the same in this scenario. Because the tactics used, including proxy attacks, including propaganda-type information, is revealing exactly how America operates when it comes to its diplomatic foreign dealings. In this video, we're going to analyze just that, so that all of you can be put on clear notice as to what to look out for when we see America dealing on the continent. If you're interested in that, stay tuned. For those of you that don't know, my name is TJ, I am Nigerian and British mixed. And on this channel, we talk about African geopolitics. I'm sure all of you are keeping up with the crazy news happening right now in the Middle East. And it got me thinking, could we replace Iran with any given African country right now and see that country go through a similar conflict? And maybe even if the conflict doesn't happen, the things that lead up to the potential conflict could be enough to manipulate a country into course correcting and changing its actions for the benefit of a country like the United States. So let's get into the information.
I know what my country does. I suspect most of you do too. And it should not be ignored, because the wars are going to continue until we have real agency, not pseudo-agency. And by the way, there is no international community. We're trying to make one, but it doesn't exist right now. That's the tragedy in this world. There is no community. There are interests. There are militaries. There are regime change operations. This is not community. We need real community. And by the way, I give every day my volunteer time to the UN for 25 years because I believe in it. It's my life commitment. So I believe in community. This has been a desire of the Israeli government that stretches back more than 25 years. Netanyahu's idea is make the Middle East in Israel's image, overthrow every government that opposes Israel. He's had a friend in that, and that is the CIA and the United States government.
The conflict between Israel and Iran that started on June 13th, 2025, is more than just another Middle East war. Could it be creating a dangerous template that might be used against African nations, especially countries like the alliance of Sahel states who refuse to bow to American demands? Let's break down exactly what's happening and why every African should be paying attention. Right now, Israel claims Iran was weeks away from building nuclear weapons. They say this justified their massive bombing campaign that has killed over 240 Iranians, including civilians. But Iran denies seeking nuclear weapons, and their supreme leader has even issued a religious ruling calling nuclear weapons unethical. Does this sound familiar? It should. This appears to follow exactly what happened with Iraq in 2003. The Bush administration claimed Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They said there was no doubt Iraq posed an immediate threat. Vice President Dick Cheney warned that we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. But it was all lies. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found in Iraq. The intelligence was either completely wrong or deliberately twisted to support a war that killed over 100,000 Iraqi civilians and cost America trillions of dollars. Are we seeing the same playbook being used against Iran? Claim an immediate threat exists, use selective intelligence while ignoring any evidence that contradicts the narrative. Then launch preemptive military action before anyone can properly verify the claims. This template could be extremely dangerous for Africa. The same playbook might be applied to any country that doesn't follow American orders. The alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, could be prime candidates for such tactics. These countries may have already painted targets on their backs simply by asserting real sovereignty, saying no to Western exploitation, and keeping their resources for their own people instead of shipping them to Europe and America for pennies on the dollar. Here's how it might work. American military officials have already claimed that local terrorists may soon have the capability to strike inside the United States directly. This was coupled with statements that the Sahel is now the epicenter of global terrorism. It would not be a big step for American intelligence agencies to claim that terrorist groups in the Sahel are close to acquiring weapons of mass destruction. They might say that uranium from Niger is being used to build dirty bombs. They could even claim that Chinese or Russian advisors are helping develop chemical weapons programs to add fuel to the existing anti-Russia and anti-China narrative. None of this would need to be true. It would just have to sound scary enough to justify military intervention. America has already shown its willingness to use this approach. So, we must ask, what happens when diplomatic efforts fail? Military pressure will likely follow. Trump's transactional diplomacy makes this even more likely. He sees everything as a business deal. If the AES countries won't sell their minerals cheaply to American companies, he might decide it's easier to take them by force. Consider what just happened to Chad, which provides a perfect example of how this template works in practice. Chad ended its defense cooperation agreement with France in November 2024, describing it as a turning point that would enable Chad to redefine its strategic partnerships. The last French military base was handed over to Chadian authorities in January 2025, ending France's 60-year military presence there. Chad had also asked the United States to remove its 75 Special Forces personnel from the country in April 2024. These troops had been stationed at a French military base in the capital N'Djamena as part of counter-terrorism operations. Just months after Chad asked all foreign troops to leave, Trump placed Chad on a comprehensive travel ban list. This banned Chadian citizens from entering the United States entirely, citing national security concerns. Chad's president Idris Deby responded by immediately suspending visa issuance to US citizens and instructing his government to act according to principles of reciprocity. South Africa could be facing a different but equally dangerous version of this template. Trump has already threatened 100% tariffs on all BRICS countries if they try to create an alternative to the US dollar. He's accused South Africa of human rights violations over land reform and demanded they cut ties with Iran, Russia, and China. But what's really happening is this. South Africa is trying to build economic relationships that don't depend on America. They're working with other global South countries to trade in their own currencies instead of always using dollars. They're refusing to support every American foreign policy position. For this, they're being painted as a threat to American interests. Trump's administration has already cut aid to South Africa and is considering broader sanctions. They appear to be using the same propaganda techniques we've seen before. American politicians claim that South Africa's land reform program is racial persecution. This narrative serves a clear purpose. It makes military or economic intervention look justified. It turns South Africa from a victim of ongoing colonialism into an aggressor that needs to be stopped. At the heart of all this is resource control. Africa has the minerals that power the modern world: lithium for electric car batteries, cobalt for smartphones, uranium for nuclear power, and rare earth elements for military technology. Western countries, especially America, have built their wealth by extracting these resources cheaply from Africa. Colonial powers drew borders to make extraction easier. They installed puppet governments that would sign terrible deals. They used debt and structural adjustment programs to force African countries to sell their resources for almost nothing. But now some African countries are saying no. They want fair prices for their resources. They want to process materials locally instead of just shipping raw materials abroad. They want partnerships instead of exploitation. This could terrify Western powers because their entire economic model depends on cheap African resources. If African countries start demanding fair deals, it might cost Western companies trillions of dollars. So they might use propaganda to justify taking what they want by force. They create narratives about terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, human rights violations, or threats to democracy. These narratives make military intervention look necessary and justified. The Israel-Iran conflict shows exactly how this narrative control works in real time. Israeli officials claim their strikes are surgical and only target military sites. But Iranian officials show evidence of destroyed residential buildings, schools, and hospitals. They report that 70 women and children have been killed in just 3 attacks. Western media largely repeats Israeli claims without question. They describe Iranian responses as retaliation, while describing Israeli attacks as self-defense. They focus on Israeli casualties while downplaying Palestinian and Iranian civilian deaths. This doesn't appear to be accidental. It seems to be a coordinated information campaign designed to shape public opinion. The goal appears to be making Israeli aggression look justified while making any resistance look like terrorism. One of the most cynical aspects of this template might be how democracy gets weaponized. Western powers claim to support democracy, but only when democratic governments do what they want. Another weapon in this arsenal could be climate policy. Western countries spent over 200 years burning fossil fuels to get rich. Now they're trying to prevent African countries from using their own fossil fuel resources to develop. They claim this is about fighting climate change. But notice how these same countries continue to import oil and gas from dictatorships while blocking African energy projects. They demand that Africa transition to renewable energy while continuing to target extraction of cheap fossil fuels themselves. This creates perfect conditions for intervention. When African countries can't develop economically because of climate restrictions, they become unstable. Western powers then claim they need to intervene for humanitarian reasons or to fight terrorism. Meanwhile, the real goal could be controlling African resources and preventing genuine African development that might threaten Western economic dominance. The sanctions weapon shows how economic warfare prepares the ground for military action. Look at how sanctions were used against Iraq before the 2003 invasion. Over a decade of sanctions contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children through malnutrition and lack of medical supplies. Then, the same countries that imposed these sanctions claimed they needed to invade Iraq for humanitarian reasons. Don't get me wrong, I'm no supporter of Saddam Hussein's leadership. But what America did left Iraq devastated and created the conditions for ISIS to rise up. It's that same ISIS that now threatens America from within African borders. They use the problems created by their own actions to justify further military action. Let's not forget that pressure also comes through financial warfare. The US controls the SWIFT banking network that most international transactions use. They can block countries from accessing their own money held in Western banks. Trump has already shown he's willing to use these weapons against African countries. His threats against BRICS nations include cutting them off from the American economy entirely. For countries that depend on trade with the US, this could cause immediate economic collapse. When direct military intervention is too risky, Western powers might use proxy forces. In Libya, they armed rebel groups to overthrow Gaddafi. In Syria, they supported opposition forces against Assad. In Ukraine, they're using Ukrainian forces to fight Russia. It's not a stretch to believe that this is happening right now throughout Africa. The continent has numerous armed groups that are wreaking havoc against governments that resist Western control. Terrorist organizations like Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab could receive covert support if it serves Western interests. If terrorist attacks increase, Western powers can claim that Russian and Chinese involvement is making things worse. They can always argue that only Western military intervention can restore stability. Modern warfare isn't just about guns and bombs. It's about controlling information and technology. Western powers can shut down internet access, block social media, or flood information spaces with propaganda. The template we might be seeing developed through the Israel-Iran conflict provides the perfect cover for this kind of intervention. Instead of admitting they want to control African resources, Western powers can claim they're fighting terrorism, preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction, or protecting human rights. Intelligence agencies play a crucial role in this system. They can manufacture evidence of threats that don't exist. They can amplify real problems to make them seem worse. They can create connections between unrelated events to build a narrative of danger. Look at how intelligence was used to justify the Iraq War. Intelligence agencies took isolated pieces of information, removed context, and assembled them into a picture of imminent threat. Aluminum tubes became evidence of nuclear weapons programs. Chemical facilities became biological weapons labs. Meetings between officials became terrorist conspiracies. The same techniques could be used against African countries. Mining operations could be portrayed as weapons programs. Trade relationships could be described as military alliances. Development projects could be called dual-use facilities with military potential. Once these narratives are established, they become very difficult to challenge. Anyone who questions the intelligence is accused of being naive about security threats. Anyone who opposes intervention is labeled as supporting terrorism or authoritarianism. The media plays a crucial role in spreading these narratives. Most major Western media outlets have close relationships with intelligence agencies. They regularly publish stories based on anonymous intelligence sources without independently verifying the information. During the build-up to the Iraq War, newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post published numerous stories about Iraqi weapons programs based on intelligence leaks. These stories helped build public support for the war. Only later did we learn that much of this intelligence was wrong or deliberately misleading. African countries are particularly vulnerable to this kind of media manipulation because they have limited ability to present alternative narratives to Western audiences. African media outlets don't have the global reach of CNN or BBC. African governments don't have the same relationships with Western journalists. This means that Western narratives about African countries often go unchallenged in international media. If American intelligence agencies claim that a terrorist group in Mali is working with Russian advisors to develop chemical weapons, how would ordinary people in America or Europe know if this is true? Social media makes this manipulation even easier. Bots and fake accounts can amplify certain stories while suppressing others. Hashtags and trending topics can be manufactured to create the appearance of grassroots concern about particular issues. We've seen this pattern repeated in conflicts around the world. Before NATO bombed Libya, social media was flooded with stories about Gaddafi's brutality. Before the intervention in Syria, similar stories circulated about Assad's government. Many of these stories were later proven false or exaggerated, but by then the damage was done. Modern warfare isn't primarily about territorial conquest, it's about economic control. The goal isn't to occupy countries, but to control their resources and markets. This is why sanctions have become such an important weapon. They can destroy a country's economy without firing a single shot. They can create the conditions for political instability that then justifies intervention. Look at how sanctions work in practice. First, they make it difficult for the target country to engage in international trade. Banks won't process transactions, shipping companies won't transport goods, insurance companies won't provide coverage. This causes shortages of essential goods like food, medicine, and fuel. Prices rise, living conditions deteriorate. People become frustrated with their government's inability to provide basic services. Opposition groups then emerge, promising to restore relations with the West if they come to power. These groups often receive covert support from Western intelligence agencies. They organize protests and strikes that further destabilize the government. If the government tries to crack down on these protests, Western media portrays this as evidence of authoritarianism. If the government doesn't crack down, the protests grow larger and more disruptive. Eventually, the government either falls to a Western-backed opposition or becomes so weakened that it accepts whatever terms the West demands. Either way, Western control is restored. For African countries, this means that military coups or invasions might not be the primary threat. Economic warfare could be much more dangerous and harder to resist. Countries like the AES states are particularly vulnerable because they're landlocked and depend on coastal neighbors for access to international markets. If those neighbors are pressured to cut trade relationships, the landlocked countries can be economically strangled. The template also includes humanitarian intervention. This is when Western powers claim they need to intervene to protect civilian populations from their own governments. The key to this strategy is establishing that a government is systematically abusing its own people. This can be done through selective reporting of real incidents, exaggeration of problems, or sometimes completely fabricated stories. Once the narrative of systematic abuse is established, Western powers can claim they have a responsibility to protect the civilian population. This gives them moral justification for military intervention that might otherwise seem like unprovoked aggression. Libya is a perfect example. NATO claimed it was intervening to protect civilians from Gaddafi's forces, but the intervention led to years of civil war that killed far more civilians than Gaddafi's government ever did. International organizations often play a role in legitimizing these narratives. Human rights groups, think tanks, and academic institutions can provide seemingly objective reports that support intervention. Many of these organizations receive funding from Western governments or corporations with interests in the targeted countries. This creates conflicts of interest that are rarely disclosed when their reports are cited in media coverage. Western powers claim to support the rules-based international order, but they regularly violate international law when it serves their interests. NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia, the invasion of Iraq, the intervention in Libya, and numerous other actions were all violations of international law. But Western countries claim these violations were justified by higher moral principles. At the same time, they demand strict adherence to international law from countries they oppose. Any violation, no matter how minor, becomes evidence of that country's disregard for international norms. The template also includes economic incentives for collaboration. Countries that cooperate with Western demands receive aid, investment, and favorable trade terms. Countries that resist face isolation and economic pressure. This creates a system where African leaders have strong personal incentives to maintain good relationships with Western powers, even if this goes against their country's long-term interests. Leaders who cooperate might receive personal benefits like aid for their political campaigns, business opportunities for their families, or guarantees of safe haven if they're ever forced from power. Leaders who resist face not just economic pressure on their countries, but personal threats as well. They might be targeted with sanctions that freeze their personal assets. They might face international arrest warrants. They might even face assassination attempts. But leaders like Ibrahim Traore represent a different model. They appear willing to accept personal risks in order to pursue policies that benefit their countries rather than Western interests. This makes them particularly dangerous to the existing system and potentially high priority targets for the kind of intervention template we might be seeing develop. The most effective resistance often comes from building alternative systems rather than just opposing existing ones. This is why initiatives like BRICS, the AES, and other South-South cooperation frameworks are so important. By creating alternative trade relationships, payment systems, and security arrangements, global South countries can reduce their dependence on Western-controlled systems. This makes them less vulnerable to economic warfare and political pressure. But building these alternatives also makes them targets for intervention. Western powers understand that their global dominance depends on preventing the emergence of viable alternatives to their control systems. Now, let's examine how this conflict is already hurting Africa economically, because these immediate costs show why Africans should care about what might seem like a distant war. The Israel-Iran war has caused oil prices to surge by over 20% in just a few days. Brent crude jumped from around $67 per barrel to over $74, with analysts warning it could reach $90 or even $100 if the conflict escalates. For Africa, this means immediate pain at the gas pump and in food markets. Most African countries import oil, so higher prices hit them hard. Transportation costs go up. Food prices rise because farming and shipping become more expensive. Oil importing African countries face a double burden. Not only do they pay more for energy, but their currencies often weaken when global uncertainty rises. This makes all imports more expensive, not just oil. The conflict has also disrupted shipping routes. Insurance costs for ships traveling through the Red Sea and Persian Gulf have increased dramatically. About 20% of the world's oil travels through the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has threatened to close. Food security is another major concern. Higher energy prices mean higher costs for fertilizers, which are often made from natural gas. Many African countries already struggle with food security, and more expensive fertilizers could reduce crop yields just when populations are growing rapidly. The conflict has also affected global investment flows. When investors get scared about geopolitical risks, they pull money out of emerging markets and put it in safe haven assets like US Treasury bonds or gold. Currency markets have been particularly brutal. The South African rand, Nigerian naira, and other African currencies have weakened significantly since the conflict began. Central banks across Africa now face impossible choices. They could raise interest rates to defend their currencies, but that would slow economic growth and make it harder for businesses and individuals to get loans. Or they could keep rates low to support growth, but watch their currencies collapse and inflation soar. Countries like Egypt, which imports most of its wheat, face severe pressures. Not only are energy costs higher, but grain prices often rise alongside oil prices because transportation becomes more expensive. Tourism, a major source of income for countries like Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa, could suffer if higher oil prices make international travel more expensive. The manufacturing sector also takes a hit. Countries like Morocco and Tunisia that have built export-oriented manufacturing industries face higher production costs and reduced competitiveness in global markets. But perhaps most dangerously, the economic pressure creates political instability that Western powers can then exploit. When people can't afford food or fuel, they protest. When governments can't provide basic services, they lose legitimacy. The global financial system's dollar dominance makes everything worse. Because oil is priced in dollars, countries need dollars to buy energy. When the dollar strengthens during crises, it becomes even more expensive for African countries to buy oil. Stock markets across Africa have fallen as investors flee to safer assets. This reduces the value of pension funds and investment portfolios, hitting ordinary Africans who thought they were building wealth for retirement. The debt situation becomes even more precarious when currencies weaken and interest rates rise. Many African countries borrowed heavily when global interest rates were low. Now they face higher costs to service that debt, just as their revenues are under pressure from slower economic growth. Countries like Ghana and Zambia that were already in debt distress face even more severe challenges. The combination of higher borrowing costs, weaker currencies, and reduced government revenues could force more African countries into debt default. Infrastructure development becomes more expensive when energy and materials costs rise. Higher oil prices make these projects more expensive just when many African governments are facing budget pressures. Mining operations face higher operating costs when fuel prices rise. This could make some marginal mines unprofitable, reducing export revenues and employment in mining-dependent communities. Even oil exporting countries like Nigeria and Angola don't necessarily benefit from higher prices. These countries often import refined petroleum products, so they pay higher prices for gasoline and diesel even while earning more from crude oil exports. International aid and development finance could decrease as donor countries face their own economic pressures from higher energy costs. Western countries dealing with inflation and slower growth are often less willing to maintain foreign aid budgets. The remittances that many African families depend on could decline if higher energy costs reduce economic growth in countries where African diaspora communities work. The informal economy, which employs most workers in many African countries, gets hit particularly hard by higher fuel and food prices. Street vendors, taxi drivers, and small traders have little ability to pass higher costs onto customers who are themselves struggling with rising prices. Women and children suffer disproportionately from these economic pressures. Higher food and fuel prices often mean that families reduce spending on education and healthcare. Girls are often the first to be pulled out of school when families face economic hardship. The Israel-Iran conflict may seem far from Africa, but its economic impacts are already being felt in markets, households, and communities across the continent. And if the conflict escalates, or if the same template gets applied to African countries themselves, the costs could be far higher than just expensive oil and food. This is why understanding what we might call the Trump template isn't just an academic exercise. It's about recognizing the patterns of aggression before they're used against African countries and African people. The time to resist these narratives is now, before they become the justification for the next war. So what do you guys think out there? Do you think my theories are crazy, or am I on the money? I would love to hear in the comments section. But if you're not the type that writes comments and you have nothing to say, would it be too much for me to ask you to write the words pattern recognition in the comments section? It just lets me know that you've watched the video to the end, you support the channel, you like what I'm doing, and you want me to continue. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.